This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. So today's program, our guest today is Karen Holmes, who recently retired after 20 years of service to the Grace Hudson Museum. For those not familiar with Karen, she came to the Grace Hudson Museum with a master's degree in library science and also with experience as a graphic designer. At the museum, she served as registrar, archivist, curator, graphic designer, and Carpenter Hudson family historian, sometimes all at the same time. I would argue that in her time here, Karen has become the foremost authority on the history of Grace Hudson's family, Grace and Grace Hudson's family. Now, today's program was originally going to be a live stream on April 22nd. And the plan was to actually have Karen in the Grace Hudson Gallery, the Hart Gallery at the back of the museum, and she would give her talk live from that gallery. But we experienced a number of technical difficulties, largely concerning our Wi-Fi capabilities here at the museum. So we decided to postpone the program and rethink what the format should be. And so last week, Alyssa Bogue, our curator now, video recorded Karen doing this tour and talk in the gallery. So what you'll see today is a video recording of Karen's tour of the Hart Gallery and her comments about Grace and her history and her relevancy. And so the video is about 37 minutes long. Karen, though, is with us on today's program. Karen, do you want to, Karen, where are you? Where did you go? There you are.
Here I am.
There you go. All right, there's Karen. I just wanted to make sure that everybody remembers who Karen is. Karen, I just want to add, we miss you very much. We wish we still had you here and seeing you
thank you.
today. Yeah. So anyway, Karen will return at the conclusion of the video, and we'll do a little Q&A with her. And again, feel free to put comments and questions in the chat box. So Karen's going to say goodbye, and I will too. And I will take a moment. Bear with me. I'm probably going to fumble this a little bit, but I'm going to share my screen and begin our video.
Hello, my name is Karen Holmes, and I'm the recently retired curator of collections and exhibits at the Grace Hudson Museum in Ukiah, California. We closed due to COVID restrictions about a year ago, and so we're taking this opportunity to show you around the I&B Hart Gallery and see some things that went on display shortly before or shortly after we closed down a year ago. We also call this gallery Grace's Gallery informally, and it's the gallery where we highlight the work of the artistic career of Grace Carpenter Hudson. Grace Carpenter was born in Potter Valley in 1865. That's very close to Ukiah. And her pioneer parents had moved there to the valley about 6 years earlier. And they were neighbors to the indigenous Pomo Indian people. And they maintained a lifelong relationship with their friends and neighbors there, even after they had moved here to Ukiah in 1869. And Grace maintained those relationships throughout her life. So the title of my talk is Grace Under Pressure, What Makes Grace Hudson Relevant Today? And to discover that relevancy, let's put her in context by walking around the room and talking about her life, her schooling, and her eventual successful career as a portrait painter of Pomo Indian peoples. We're going to head over here to her self-portrait that she did when she was only 15. And I'm going to do the archivally correct thing here and put some gloves on so that we can see a special treat that we brought out just for this tour today. You can see the self-portrait, life-size, and we've brought out the dress that Grace is wearing in the painting that we believe she probably made herself. It's definitely handmade, unlined. You can see inside here. It's actually more of a costume than an actual dress that you would wear every day. And she painted the flowers on the skirt and on the matching fan, as you can see in the painting too. But being an artist, Grace took a little artistic license and changed a few things in the painting. You can see there's a lot more lace in the painting at the cuffs and around the neck. And she's changed the color a little bit too. The panels where the flowers are painted are more blue than they are in reality here. And we also brought out some photos of her wearing the dress when she was only 15. And it was July 4th, 1880. And I believe that had something to do with the fact that her father had recently bought a newspaper here in town. And I think it was the inaugural opening of the newspaper or something on July 4th that she was so dressed up for. And now we're going to talk a little bit about her career as a student. And at the time Grace was growing up here in Ukiah, there was no high school, and you only had to go to school until you were about 14. But she was artistically talented, and her parents wanted her to have further schooling, so she needed to leave Ukiah, and they all decided she could move to San Francisco and go to school at the California School of Design, which was the premier art school west of the Mississippi. And she started there about age 14. All her school records were destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and fire, so we don't know exactly when she began and ended her schooling. But you had to be 14 to attend, and she turned 14 about a month after school started, so I believe that's when she started, when she was 14. And her skill set exploded when she got professional training, and she was invited by her teachers to join the other most talented students in the school to compete for a medal, drawing from a cast or sculpture. And she went on to win the award. This is the Alvord Gold Medal, named after the San Francisco mayor. And we don't know if she received the medal like that or if she turned it into a piece of jewelry herself. But it seems very Grace-like to do something like that. And this is actually the drawing that she won the award for, the Achilles. The students at the school, besides drawing from sculptures, would draw from still lifes, as you see here. And this, of course, was because it was much easier to really look at something and learn about proportion and layout and lighting with something that wasn't moving. So that was one of the first things students would learn. And here in the museum, we moved to transitional pieces that bridge between her art school days and her professional career. So here we have a still life, and it's still got this dark background that was popular during her art school days. But you'll see she's starting to move now towards what would become her subject matter for the rest of her life, the Pomo people and their culture. She's put the vegetables into a Pomo basket, which is unusual. And she also did another very Grace-like thing. She painted a little fly on the turnip that's so realistic that people often think it's a real fly. And I think she was just teasing her audience to make sure that you were really looking carefully at her painting. And here is a transitional portrait. So she's starting to work with the subject matter of a Pomo woman. The background is starting to lighten up a little bit from her art school days, but it doesn't have the really highly finished surface that you'll see in some of her more mature works. It was really her husband, John Hudson, who encouraged her to paint the Pomo Indian people. John had been a medical doctor in Nashville, Tennessee, but he always wanted to be an anthropologist. And as soon as his father died, he was also a doctor, he left Tennessee, got a job in California as the physician on the railroad, and the end of the railroad line was here in Ukiah. So that's why he ended up here. And he soon met Grace Hudson, and because of his interest in anthropology and her family's connections with the Pomo people, it was a match made in heaven. And here we've got some special photos that we brought out from the collection of John and Grace. They married in 1890, once Grace had come back from art school. And he began collecting Pomo baskets, just as Grace's mother and Grace herself had done. So she began to paint the Pomo Indians. There was a nostalgia at the time for the Old West that people felt was rapidly disappearing. So they were capitalizing a little bit on that feeling of nostalgia for the recent past. And it was also a way to drum up business for John's basket collection. He had begun amassing quite a spectacular collection of Pomo basketry, and he wanted to sell it. So by Grace painting the Pomo people, and he started writing about Pomo basketry, they sort of created a market for their work. And she did paint ethnographic paintings of a few other people in the course of her career, including 1 year in Hawaii in 1901, where she went for a rest cure, but also around 1904, 1905 in Oklahoma Territory, where John's boss at the time had commissioned her to paint some portraits of the Pawnee Indians. So here we have a photo of her with her friends, Eagle Chief and Roan Chief, and their wives, and she's wearing her hair in the traditional Pawnee fashion. And we've got another photo of John here in his study. I'm not sure if we captured that before. And then this is a very special thing that we brought out for this tour. In the course of Grace's career, she painted 684 numbered oils, and these are the works that she's best known for. And every time she did an oil painting that she felt was really worth sale and highly professional, she would enter it into her painting diary. So this is her actual diary. There were 3 of these. And she started number 1, National Thorn, and we'll see that in a few minutes. And the kinds of things she'd record in her diary are the title, the size, where it was displayed, when she painted it, who she sold it to, if it was in a special exhibition, things like that, who the model was. So this is a very important research tool for anyone interested in any of her numbered oils. So, as I said, most of the works in there are oils on board or oils on canvas, but sometimes she would do bitumen sketches, and we have a couple of examples of those here. Bitumen was a tar derivative that you could thin down with turpentine to create kind of a wash, and some of her better works are these bitumen sketches. And it's interesting that they sort of look like old sepia photos, and her parents had their own photo gallery here in Ukiah, so it mimics some of those old sepia tone photographs that they were doing. On this wall, we've got some examples of her techniques. So you can see she started out with pencil sketches and then light oil washes on top of that. You can see where she's changed her mind a couple of times about placement, like the doll's head here in this one. And then she would go on to layer more and more strata of oil paint until she got to her very highly finished and just little details to really bring it to life. And though she considered herself a portrait painter, she did enjoy going out into the countryside and painting landscapes. And she would take some of those landscapes and use them as background ideas for her numbered oils, as you see here. Then moving into the center of the room, these are kind of her masterworks in the center of the room. They tend to be larger, highly finished, and ethnographically significant. And one of the paintings that we added right before we shut down about a year ago was this one, the Dowry. And it was painted in 1901, right after she got back from her year in Hawaii, and I'll talk about that in a moment. but we set up this case next to the painting so that you can see some of the objects in our collection that directly relate to that painting. The clamshell disc bead and magnesite necklaces, and the dowry bag, which was part of a bride's trousseau, and one of the baskets that's in the painting. And all the baskets in that particular painting were in Grace's actual collection of basketry. And that's one of the strengths of this museum, is that we have things in our collections that Grace painted in her paintings. We've got photographs of some of the people who are pictured in the works, and it's this really nice cross-fertilization of things. And we have that happening here too with her painting, The Sea Conjurer, where you can see the man wearing his flicker quill headband, and then we have an example of the band here. And this is very articulated. When pomo dancers dance, it waves around. It's really fantastic. And over on this side of our central area, we've got actually what I'd call genre paintings. So though she was a portrait painter who did landscapes, I'd say you could also call her a genre painting in some instances. And this is a great painting to show you the types of things that Pomo people were working on. In this picture, we've got a man making the clamshell disc beads that we just saw in the necklace across the room, and a woman starting a basket. So she would weave around that, and the basket would start to make a bowl shape, and then you'd trim the little pieces off at the end to make your finished basket. And another scene of life, I wouldn't say everyday life, but an important ceremony in the Pomo culture was a funeral ceremony. And this was a very rare depiction of something like this. And you see another example of the flicker quill headband on the doctor's head there. He's got it rolled and it goes down the back of his head instead of running horizontally like the other one. Over here we've got National Thorn, #1, the entry I showed you in the diary. This is the painting. And this was the first one that she thought was worthy of entering into her diary. It was purchased by a man who had affiliation with an art exhibit in Minnesota, and he had come to visit the Hudsons about baskets and saw this canvas on Grace's easel and bought it on the spot. So she wasn't even finished with it yet, and off it went to Minnesota, where it was purchased. We don't know if she put the redwood frame around it. That's of course symbolic of California, the redwood. In general, I think she would just roll her canvases up and deliver them to her dealers. And she had dealers across the country, and then have the dealers frame the paintings or the people who purchased it. And I missed this one back over here, but this is one of my favorites, where you can really see her skill and her attention to detail. If you look very closely, you can see dirt underneath the fingernails and toenails of the child. You can see the threadbareness of that outfit that the child is wearing. And then there's such a contrast between the lush fur of the dog, the bone, the fire. She's got all these different textures going on in there, and very skillfully done. Now we're going to head over to another big one in the center of the room, Blue Monday. And this is another example of Grace's sense of humor, because she's really playing with the title. Monday was traditionally the day to do laundry, so we've got a Pomo Indian woman probably on a Monday doing some laundry, and she's got a crying baby in the traditional cradle basket on her back. So he's blue, he's crying, and then right to the left of his head is the bottle of bluing, which was something you would add to laundry to make it white. So the bluing, the blue baby, the laundry on Monday, all wraps up to make that title Blue Monday. And it's again, Grace having a little fun, I think, with her audience. And as I mentioned, she did spend 1 year in Hawaii, the year of 1901. And she had been working so hard the year before that. She was turning out paintings around the size of the small one here, about one of those every 2 weeks. And she was just exhausted, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, really. Her hands were shaking, she couldn't sleep, she was losing weight, and she couldn't even imagine painting anymore. So she told John that he needed to get a paying job. He had given up his medical career to devote himself to anthropology, but he wasn't employed by anyone. He was doing a lot of research on his own. So she asked that he get a paying job, and then she would go rest in Hawaii, which was kind of a popular thing to do at the time. And here we've got some photos of her in Hawaii and the hotel she stayed at when she was there in Honolulu. And so for about 4 months, she just rested. And it was an open-ended idea about when she would come back. John thought it would be a few months. She kept putting it off, and she started really enjoying herself there in Hawaii. And after about 4 months, she started painting the local Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiian, Chinese children and women that were on the islands of Oahu and Hawaii. And collectors, Hawaiian art collectors, are just as thrilled by her work as early California collectors are, because of her attention to ethnographic detail, like the seed necklace on the woman here, or the little jade bracelet on the Chinese child. So she painted what she was seeing and what was culturally important to the people she was representing. And finally, John became ill from the stress of not knowing when Grace would return. And so she finally did come back 11 months after she left. And they went to Chicago together, where he did a little work and she met his boss. And then they went on to New York for something of a second honeymoon. And when they got back to Hawaii, or back to Ukiah, that's when she painted the dowry, which we saw earlier over there with the artifacts. So it was kind of a reference maybe to her renewed commitment to her marriage. They remained married the rest of their lives, and so whatever the issues were, they worked them out. Here in this corner, we've got an example of salon hanging, and this is how you would have seen art hung during Grace's day. And for the museum staff, it was a practical move. We have many more paintings that have been gifted to us and loaned to us than we can ever show at one time. So this was a way to really get a lot of paintings in one place. And these little miniatures are really lovely. They're some of her better work, I think. And this area that we're moving into has a lot of animals in it. Grace is known for her paintings of dogs particularly, but she also loved rabbits and other animals. And she would sometimes base her paintings on a Pomo legend, and then she would type the legend up and it would get attached to the back of the painting. This one, The Dawn of Song, illustrates how all the different animals and birds got their bird song or their different animal sounds. And the more you look at the painting, the more animals pop out to you. And our school children on tours really love this painting, trying to guess how many different animals are in there. We've got our traditional Northern California jackrabbit here. And in this next painting of Coolin, this was a little girl known to Grace and her family, and the Pomo family owned this little pet fox. So she named this the Foxes. Again, a little kind of joke with the viewer about the title. Towards the end of her life in the 1930s, it was the Great Depression, and people weren't buying paintings much anymore, obviously. And so she was casting around for another way to make a living. And a friend of hers named Jean Warfield had created a doll called a Splash Me doll that was kind of like a Cupid doll. and it became an instant hit with women. So it was for adult women to decorate their rooms or as an accessory. And so Grace thought she might do a boudoir doll too, and she invented this whole family of rabbits, and she called it the Rabbit Rancheria. In this part of the world, Indian reservations are known as rancherias, and so that's what she named it after. And it's based on actual figures in her family. She was a twin. She had a twin brother, so we've got the twin rabbits being read to by their grandfather. And the Hudsons actually had a Chinese housekeeper, Mr. Wong, and so she's got Mr. Wong Rabbit doing the laundry here. But she could never find anyone to manufacture these during the Depression, and so these prototypes are the only examples we have of what she intended. But she made all the little props to display them. I believe that they were actually in Gump's department store window in San Francisco at one time. And another project she had during the 30s, in addition to painting, was a garden sculpture of a jackrabbit. And so we've got her prototypes for that too. But again, she couldn't find anyone to manufacture them. They were very difficult to make. The ears kept breaking off in particular. So this is one of a few of the rabbits that she worked on herself. And she was very adept at a number of different kinds of media. She also designed hooked rugs. She even designed her own cemetery plot for her and her family with a phoenix sculpture at the plot, and that's in the Ukiah Cemetery. And you can go up there and sit there and contemplate how she used to bring friends there to have picnics before her death. Now we're going to go to the case in the center of the room, and this is where we put a lot of new things around the time that the museum closed. And it's a chance to explore some different aspects of her career and interesting stories about her. So we start out with some sketches from her sketchbook. She was a very assiduous sketchbook drawer. And she started here on the left. When she first moved to San Francisco, she was living in a boarding house that was run by a woman who also gave art lessons, Mrs. Preble, and that's a portrait of her on the left. And you can see this is before she had much training. The figure's pretty flat. There's a wide variety from light to dark, and the tone, the sketch, the lines are pretty regular. And only 3 years later, in the sketchbook from her art school days, you can see the difference. The figure looks three-dimensional. There's a real range in value. The wavy line varies in width, and you can see that she's really taken a great leap forward after getting professional training. Here's a nice little delicate sketch she did after art school, around the time that she met the man that would become her first husband, William T. Davis. We believe they met through friends. They were only married about a year before they separated, and the marriage was against the wishes of her parents. After the year of marriage, she moved back to Ukiah, and it took another year for the divorce to become final. And it was Grace who filed for divorce. We don't know much about that marriage, and there aren't very many examples of her work signed Grace Davis, but there are a few. And this pen and ink may have been an illustration for a magazine. She did some of that work in the late 1880s to 1890s. And that could be the initial letter T for the beginning of an article. And we'll see some more examples of her illustration work when we get on the other side of the case. This area is devoted to her most famous painting, number 5, Little Mendocino. And we've got a contact print from a photo her father took of it before it left her easel. And she had that on display at the Mechanics Institute Fair in San Francisco in 1893, and it was so popular, legend has it that it was moved to a different part of the room so more people could watch or look at it comfortably. And it was such a hit that she was invited to show it at the Chicago World's Fair, or Columbian World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And she won a special award for it in San Francisco and an honorable mention for it in Chicago. But within a few years, it started getting copied, and we don't know how or why that happened particularly, except that we know the real painting was on display in a dealer's window in San Francisco alongside an identical copy. And the identical copy was priced much less than her painting, and all the artists in the city thought that was unfair, and there was kind of a scandal about it. But a few years later, all these little postcard-sized copies started showing up. They're usually on a redwood panel. They're painted over a photograph of the painting. We don't know if she did some of them herself or not. Some are not very skillful, some are. And then it was also appropriated for advertising and other things like this Christmas card, and then this cover for a dance card for a ball that was held in San Francisco in 1903 by the Improved Order of Red Men, which was a bunch of white guys pretending to be Indians, as far as I can tell. And they've taken her little Mendocino illustration or painting and turned it into a cover for their dance card. And she could do, really large, beautiful paintings down to these little miniatures. And then this one is very interesting. It was found in a Goodwill store in South Carolina. It is signed, and so the man Googled who Grace Hudson was, discovered the museum, and contacted us and asked us if we knew anything about it, which we didn't. But as far as we can tell, it is number 13 in her painting diary, which she called a miniature copy of National Thorn, her first painting that we've looked at over here. And she said that it was painted on an opal plaque, and we didn't know what that was. But when this turned up, I did a little research and I found references to opal plaques in photographic supply catalogs in England in the 1880s that said they were white and concave. So I believe that it was a plate that you could get a photograph, you could put your photograph on it and display it, and she used it instead as the base for one of her paintings. So always creative, and she would have had access to something like that since her parents were photographers. Now on this side, we've got some examples of some of her other media. She did beautiful watercolors. You don't see those as often as you do the oils. And she also did illustrations, as I mentioned before. So here we have an ink wash illustration that was in Illustrators Quarterly, which featured the work of illustrators around the country. And then she's got a sweet little pen and ink of her nephew here, who's got his long ringlets, as boys wore them back then. And he's holding a cat. So I'm always happy to see cats instead of dogs in some of her works. Now over here we've got, let's see if I've got the right one here. Yeah, we have a sketch, ink wash sketch of an Asian man cooking at an open campfire. And then you can see in the Picturesque Route, which was a magazine about different things to do around this area, we've got what that turned into, where he's sitting with this other man cooking a trout. So you can see how she worked on her ideas over time, and they changed. And another example of that here is this great series of work for an illustration for Overland Monthly. It appeared in August 1892. We've got the actual magazine here. So Grace did a number of illustrations for this particular issue. And you can see that she starts out with just a pencil sketch, and she's trying out some ideas for placement. Then she starts refining it with her pen and ink, and then you end up with this press proof, which is just the illustration on a piece of paper, and then finally, as it appears in the magazine itself. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual title of my talk, but I have to admit that I'm rusty and I didn't memorize it, and I'm going to read it to you. But my coworker here, Alyssa, is going to take a tour around the room and show you some of her other works that we didn't look at as closely while I read my final bit here. After all you've seen, let's address the question of Grace's relevancy today. I think we can all agree that this past year has shown that racism is alive and well in the United States, that people of color continue to be discriminated against and victimized, and that there are increasing pressures for social change. This affects many institutions in the country, including museums. There is a push in museums and history-based organizations to embed the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in the way they present their collections and tell the stories associated with their missions. How does the way the Grace Hudson Museum tell Grace's story stand up to that goal? To play devil's advocate, why should we care about a dead white woman from the 19th century or her husband, whom one could say by today's standards had a paternalistic relationship with the Pomo people, the very people whose culture fueled the Hudson's successful careers? To begin with, I firmly believe that you cannot judge the behavior of people in the past by today's standards, though you can judge them on the grounds of their respect for basic human dignity and welfare. The Carpenters and Hudsons for their time actually treated their Pomo friends and acquaintances much more humanely than many others did, maintaining lifelong relationships with them and aiding them in various ways. And they truly admired the artistry of the Pomo peoples. The staff at the museum embeds the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access into the exhibition spaces by not only telling the stories of the Carpenter-Hudson families, but discussing the culture and lives of the Pomo peoples upon whom they built their life work. This is apparent in the museum's J. Ralph and Lois Stone Gallery, dedicated to Pomoan basketry, and in the museum's wild gardens that feature the native plants used by local indigenous people for food, basketry, and regalia materials, and that showcase Pomoan land management techniques. Without the interest that the Carpenters and Hudsons took in Pomo culture, this museum would not exist to tell the stories of all the peoples involved in those stories. That alone makes Grace Hudson relevant to today's concerns. But beyond that, Grace is important in American art history. Not only was she an excellent artist and technician, but she made a living as a professional artist at a time when very few women did, as their role was considered to be in the home. Additionally, she was a good businesswoman, which is not always true of artists. Significantly, she is one of the very few women artists in the country with a museum devoted to her work. Her family members also took place in many important moments in U.S. history, from the Carpenter family's arrival in Massachusetts 18 years after that of the Pilgrims, to Grace's grandmother, Clarina Nichols, campaigning for women's rights in the 1850s with her personal friend, Susan B. Anthony, and other major women's rights activists, to Grace's father, Aurelius, who literally fought alongside John Brown to ensure that Kansas Territory entered the Union as a state free from slavery. Telling their stories is telling the story of the development of the United States, which is important for all of us to process, to understand how we got to where we are today. In closing, I would say that we cannot right the wrongs of the past unless we know what those wrongs were and remember them and learn from them. We cannot treat others with dignity without appreciating their culture. And in an increasingly mean-spirited world, we need to celebrate artistry, humanity, and positive achievement to feed our souls. These are the concerns of today, and the stories of Grace and her family and the Pomo people that are told in this museum are relevant to those concerns. Thank you for taking this tour. I encourage you to come here in person someday when you can see the gallery yourself. And for those of you who are watching this live, we're going to take some questions and comments now. Thank you again.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you as well to Alyssa Bogue for recording that video. I want to ask Karen if she could unmute herself and return so we can do a few questions. All right. Hi, hello again. That was absolutely splendid. I do want to say, I neglected to say before we started the video for our audience that we are not the most technically sophisticated at doing videos and then sharing them through a live stream presentation. So certainly the video imagery itself, the resolution isn't as sharp as you would normally see in a really professionally made video, and the sound, we had some sound issues that they drop out here and there. Karen, I think the comments you make at the end of the video about Grace's relevancy, I think that was unfortunately one of the areas where the sound kind of dropped off. So I want to talk to you a little later about what we can do to make that public for people who maybe for them to read it, because it's very important what you talked about there. I kind of wanted to start by asking, and actually let me check out the chat room to see if people have waited. I've got a comment here from Eric. And he says, Karen, you have brought Grace Hudson to life for us. Thank you so much. And a lot of thank yous here in the chat room. Holly says, thank you for an excellent presentation. It helped me learn more about Grace and her art. So I think those sentiments are shared by many, many people here. Oh, here's a question. Amy would like to know, how did Grace's contemporaries view her? Did gender affect that?
I think so. The prime example I can think of was when she was in Hawaii, when she was recovering. And there was another artist there at the same time who you may have heard of, named Theodore Juarez, who's an early California artist, very well known, very successful. And one of his images is the signature image used by the Honolulu Museum of Art. And they were there at exactly the same time. And Grace was living in a hotel room, so she didn't have a studio. So she went to the Art Association and rented a studio there for a month. And Juarez was there at the same time. And he could have easily seen what she was working on. And two of her major Hawaiian pieces, one was a lei cellar, and one was a girl eating poi out of a calabash. Well, Juarez went on to do the exact same subjects. He did a poi eater and a lei cellar. And, you know, everyone knew about those paintings, but they didn't know about Grace's. And I think she made some private comments that, you know, she was upset about that why shouldn't she get that same recognition? And that's why she wanted to have an exhibit in Honolulu. And she did have a little one. So she made her goal. But I think being a woman did affect her success. But on the other hand, she was quite successful. So you got to give it to her for really orchestrating a national career. during her lifetime, and you know, is worldwide today, really.
Yeah. Karen, did she have gallery representation?
She had dealers who often also had art galleries. So she had representation in San Francisco, at Gump's, and also at Schussler Brothers was another one. Santa Rosa, Brunner. She had one in Chicago, one in New York, Southern California. So all over the country.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
I think a lot of contemporary artists would kill to have that, so many galleries showing their work.
Right.
And Karen, do you know, was that true for the breadth of her painting career, that she was able to sell her works through galleries in that many places?
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, the East Coast galleries may have dropped off towards the end of her career. I'm not really sure, but Santa Rosa, Brunner's was always very active, and in San Francisco too. But, you know, she died in 1936. So in the 30s, you know, she never changed her subject matter. You know, modern art was happening. I mean, Picasso was working, you know, so I think she fell out of favor a little bit and lost some of that. But her popularity waxes and wanes. You know, I don't think she will go away ever because she's just so good.
Yeah. I also am curious. Obviously, John Hudson, her husband, was very supportive of her work and encouraged her, as you said. Um,
Mhm.
do we have any documentation about how her parents, A.O. and Helen Carpenter, were they proud of her for establishing such a good career in painting?
You know, that's really interesting. No one's ever asked that before. And actually, I can't think of any correspondence or anything where they said, "We're so proud of you, honey." You know, I don't think
Hmm.
they really had that kind of relationship. And I don't know if it was within that family or just kind of a 19th century way of relating. You know, I think she was raised to be self-sufficient as her siblings were, and they kind of, you know, went out and became successful early on. And I think it was just expected to
Hmm.
do a good job at whatever it was you ended up doing. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I don't remember ever seeing anything like that.
Hmm. As I mentioned in the introduction, you basically have served as the archivist for the Grace Hudson Museum for just about all the time you spent here. Um, and I wanted to ask you about the sources of information and the sources that you found in the Grace Hudson Museum archives that helped you understand Grace, helped you interpret Grace for the larger public. Can you talk about what kind of archival material exists at the Grace Hudson Museum?
Yeah, well, I'll preface it all by saying I love reading other people's mail. So I just find that interesting. And, you know, that's kind of how I got into it at the museum. But we've got a lot of personal correspondence. And of course, it's stuff coming to her or to her parents, not the letters she wrote, because those would be sent elsewhere. So we often have one-sided conversations, but you know, a lot of personal letters, and then just different manuscript materials, and you know, supplemented. Now everything is so easy to get to online. One of the best sources is digitized newspapers, because if I had a letter with a date, let's say in Hawaii, and she mentions going somewhere, I could look in the newspapers to see if there was more information about that event, or if it listed who else went to it, or things like that. So it becomes cumulative. You know, you start reading more things, they start making more sense, you start piecing it all together over time. So but the museum has a great collection of personal materials like that.
Um, your work over 20 years, I mean, starting in the mid 90s here at the museum through today, I'm sure the advent of search engines and internet and all of that must have, as you mentioned, you were looking at newspaper clippings from other cities and whatnot.
Mhm.
You know, that must have been just a wonderful gift to any sort of researcher, huh?
Right. I mean, it was fortuitous when we were working on the Hawaii exhibit and catalog that was just really starting to get going, and it would have been impossible to do otherwise. And then there's also a lot of old books that are digitized now, like on Google Books or other sources like that, they used to write big tomes about, important men in Honolulu or whatever. And so you could find a lot of information about individual people that way too. And also her diaries are a great source, as I showed in the video, but she does give some personal information in there sometimes that's helpful.
That must be a real blessing for any historian or museum to have the personal diaries of the major subject of the museum.
Right. I mean, they're not personal diaries per
Yeah.
se, but still very helpful.
Would you call them professional diaries?
Yeah. I mean, they're only about her numbered oils, but she listed, who bought the pieces, and then you can find out about that person. And so it works together that way.
We have another question in the chat room from Amy, but I'm going to hold off on that question. I think that will be the final question I want to ask. So Amy, sit tight. We're going to get to that in a minute or two. Karen, I also wanted to ask you about, there's, to my knowledge, there's not a whole lot that's been written about Grace. We have Cy Boynton's Painter Lady book and a few others. Can you talk about maybe the dearth of literature on Grace Hudson and how that affects our ability to interpret her? Or
Well,
I might also ask, how do you feel about Cy Boynton's book? It's kind of the go-to book. It's like a catalog raisonné of her work. But as many of us know, Cy was not a professional art historian or anything like that.
yeah. Well, I have to say kudos to Cy. Professionally, he was a dentist, and he did an amazing job considering that. There are some inaccuracies in it, but he actually did a lot of research. I know that Melissa Carpenter, Grace Hudson's niece, helped him initially with that, at least with access to all the correspondence and everything that's now in the museum. My main complaint about it is that he doesn't ever say where he got the information that he's presenting as fact. So you can never check it to make sure it's right. So there are a few things.
He never had to defend it to a dissertation committee.
Right. And then, we've discovered things over time too. Though I do want to, commend Sherry Smith-Berry, the former director and curator, and Marvin Schenk. We did do a catalog on A.O. Carpenter that included some information about Grace's family. And then Sherry and I did the Days of Grace Hawaii catalog that really dug into that 1 year of her life, which no one had really ever looked at before. So I kind of think, there is a lot of good information in all those. I did write an article about Little Mendocino, that number 5 painting that has a lot of information about her early career. So it's more than some artists, I guess, not as much as others.
I suppose so. I know that there is a book about the San Francisco art scene in the late 1800s that has a chapter that includes a lot of information about Grace.
Yeah, Artful Players.
Artful Players, right.
Yeah.
Not seeing any more questions coming in from the audience, and we're a little bit past 4 o'clock. So I'm going to ask the question that Amy has posed, which I think is a very good question to close on. So Karen, Amy wants to know um, if the webinar attendees today could only take away one thing about Grace as a person or a painter, what would that be and why?
Yikes. Well, I guess I would say that I respect her and that everyone should respect her for being so self-possessed and driven and creating, you know, a lifetime worth of work and preserving a lot of information about the Pomo people. And if she hadn't done that, you know, we would know a lot less about them than we do now. So, you know, I don't think she was maybe an easy person to be around necessarily, but I think she really did the world a great service with her recording of the people and her belief in herself as an artist. I think it was there from a very young age, and it took that grit and determination to have the career that she did at the time she was active, you know, as a woman in the late 19th, early 20th century.
I think all of those things you just mentioned as the big takeaway, I think we should all be proud to say is reflected in the museum, as you made in your comments at the end of the video about her relevancy. This museum does stand for inclusivity and diversity and for telling honest stories about the relationships between Anglo people and Native peoples. And that certainly seems to be embodied in Grace's character and the big takeaway you've just given us. Well, Karen, thank you so much. I have to ask you before you go away, how are you enjoying retirement?
I'm saying it's a difficult transition for me. I'm busy. It hasn't sunk in yet, I'd say. I haven't found my retirement path.
And in full disclosure, I want the audience to know that you've been coming in once a week to help process a backlog of collections. It's really helping us out. And we get to see you at least once a week, which is always a joy. So. Yeah. All right. Well, Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for participating in the making of that wonderful video. I want to tell our audience that probably within a week or two, we will have a recording of this program up on our YouTube channel. So you can rewatch the program today there if you missed any of it or maybe had a hard time hearing some of the video. We'll try to enhance that for the YouTube presentation. You can find recordings of many of our virtual programs on the website, on our Grace Hudson website. Under the Learn tab, there's a page that we're calling Video Archives. And currently we have 5 virtual programs that we've done over the last 6 months that were recorded, and you can view those programs by finding them on our Video Archives page. So thank you again, Karen, much appreciated. Thank you to everybody in our audience. Join us 2 weeks from today on May 20th at 3 o'clock Thursday for Alyssa Bogue's virtual tour of postcards from Mecca. So we will see you then. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye.